to schools. You know, the PTF on COVID, they announced an extended lockdown this phase, modified though, wherein schools will have to reopen, but they say it will be graduating students who will be required to go to school. E-learning can continue for all the others, but there's been some talk about the rationale behind that. Some agree, others disagree, so we'll explore that as well. And now we're joined by the ASU president, Professor Ogunyemi, joining us from our studios in Abuja. Good morning, Prof. Thank you for joining us today on the program. Well, yes, they've announced that modified measure of this eased lockdown, but particularly as it has to do with that policy on school resumption. What's your impression of that policy?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. We have said that it is not auspicious to open the schools now because the number of measures that should be put in place have not been put in place. The government itself announced a number of conditions for opening schools. Schools must be decontaminated. Facilities for hand washing must be provided. Body temperature testing gadget must be provided. Opportunities for social distancing or physical distancing must be available. Teachers must be trained on how to handle emergencies and so on. These conditions, they are not there just for the papers. They are actually to be actualized in order to prevent or avert disaster for our schools and our nation. We have seen other places what they did. In our nearby Ghana here, the president came out clearly to say we are opening schools, but before we open schools, government will decontaminate all schools. Government will make sure that face masks are provided, and hand washing and body testing facilities will be made available. We have not seen that happening here. And government is saying, well, those conditions must be met. Our question is, who will meet those conditions? What is wrong in accepting responsibility? And this is where we have always disagreed with governments in Nigeria, federal, state. You see a situation in which we push our responsibilities to some invisible agents. If government reeled out these conditions, what are the roles of the state? What are the roles of SUBEB, State Universal Basic Education boards? What are the roles of local government education authorities? The thing must be clearly spelled out so that you don't just leave policies hanging. And that is what we have seen. Our own worry is that if we leave the situation like that and we have hazard arrangements for bringing back our children to schools, we can only pray that we don't witness what happened in some other countries. For instance, Israel opened the schools despite all their preconditions, all the conditions that they put in place and all the measures they put in place. They had to hurriedly close the schools again because they discovered that more infections were coming from the schools. And that is what we think should be prevented in Nigeria. We are not against opening schools, but government must not just spell out conditions. Government must tell us who will meet those conditions. And even in private schools, government cannot just leave it to the school proprietors because we are talking of public health issues here. Many of these private schools are just struggling to break even. So when you talk of public health issues, they are not issues that are to be left into the hands of individuals who can follow through according to their capacities. There must be basic minimum in order to ensure and guarantee that we are all safe. It is about our collective safety and the safety of our children.
Well, are you saying, Prof, that it's a bad time to open the schools? Because, I mean, you would also know it's not a full opening of the schools that the PTF COVID-19 is talking about. It's talking about segments of those who are in the exit level, at the exit levels of the various levels of education in Nigeria. So are you saying it's a bad time altogether, or, maybe we find a way to fine-tune the process?
Well, about the timing, it is not the timing per se. If they have enough evidence to say that we are good to go and that we are flattening the curve, despite the spike that we see here, well, we believe they have the data. If they think they are speaking to data, they are speaking to research reports, they must follow it up with meeting their own conditions. I think the essence of spelling out conditions is to prevent what may follow. But we are not seeing any concrete steps being taken about meeting their own conditions. So the timing is there, but if they say they are convinced, well, we hold them to that. We believe that they are not endangering the lives of all Nigerians by opening schools now. We have seen other schools or other places where they are opening schools. We have also seen other places where they are even delaying opening schools till August or September. So here, if government has come out to say, well, we are convinced that we can manage the situation, but we are warning against a situation where they will just leave us to what they call herd immunity, in which case they believe that, well, let the children be exposed, let us all be exposed. After some time, we develop immunity, our body will be able to handle the virus, and we should not be too afraid. Otherwise, it means that we are actually underestimating the situation. The herd immunity thing is not a certain way to go. It's not an assured path. But Nigeria should not take a gamble with the health of its citizens. And that is why we are warning that if they believe that they are convinced, we will hold them to that, but let them meet their own conditions. And that is what we have seen in policy implementations in Nigeria. We will see that they will spell out beautiful policies, attractive ideas. But when it comes to the point of implementation, we fall flat. And that is what we're about to see here. ASUU has been saying it since March, that the lockdown provides the opportunity for us to pay attention to our educational sector. Visit schools now. Many of them have grown into bushes. How do we clear? How do we decontaminate? Nobody is talking about that. These public schools they are talking about, many of them are without fences. So how do they even monitor children coming into the schools? The teachers there, how much of COVID-19 prevention and control skills do they have?
Okay.
What are they to do during emergencies?
We'll still let you speak on this a little further. Just hang on a minute. We need to bring in Professor Baz here. Let's see how he internalizes this policy announcement by the government. He is not that optimistic about some of these things. What do you think?
Well, I agree almost entirely with what Professor Ogunyemi said. But I think the point here is, you asked about timing, whether the timing was right. And I agree with that. There's nothing wrong with the timing, because we can't lock ourselves, our children, forever. Let's get that clear. We must come out of this, one way or the other. But how do we come out is very important. I'm going to take a step back and look at what we did in the first phase of relaxation after we were initially locked down. The government came and said, we're going to unlock you, FCT, Lagos, and Ogun, on these conditionalities, because the only way you can test the veracity or the dependability of the conditions set by the government to reopen the schools is by reflecting on how the conditions that were laid when they unlocked in the first times, whether they were met or not. And they said, I'll use Lagos as an example, and Lagos has been doing a fantastic job so far, don't get me wrong. But the government in Lagos said, look, commuter drivers, commuter buses, you wouldn't carry more than 50% of your passengers. There will be social distancing in the bus. You must have your face mask. And I told my friends that it's not possible. We know the kind of commuters we have in Nigeria. We know the kind of systems we have in Nigeria. Is the government going to put in enforcers on the street to police motor parks to make sure that those downfall drivers don't carry more than 50. Because my thinking then was that these drivers have been locked down for 3 months or 4 months or whatever, like myself. If they had the means, they want to actually expand their previous 100% to 300 to make up for what they've lost. But you're asking them here to cut down. That is not going to happen. And we saw what happened. It spiked beyond recognition. Then rumors started that we're going to be relocked. And I told you, relocking is a mistake. If you lock us from now for the next 10 years, one day you are going to reopen us. When you reopen us, there will be conditionalities. And if you don't employ those conditions, we'll be back in 10 years to where we were in the first place. And that is the same thing with the schools.
Yeah.
You are talking about, we are going to provide all this for schools. There must be hand washing, there must be this, this, and that. Who will provide all those? That's number one. Then there's a dichotomy between the private schools and the public schools. Because if we are not careful, we are going to sleepwalk into creating a caste system, which is there. We are going to entrench it because the public schools don't even have that capacity at all. Private schools are going to struggle.
Yeah, apparently this caught us all napping, caught the whole world napping, But one of the things that, a number of people, schools have also tried to do was to do some kind of, put some services, some educational services online, in the wake of all of that. Do you think it was helpful?
Well, largely maybe regarding private schools to some extent, but not regarding public schools. And don't forget, public schools are the primary concern of governments.
Which is why perhaps the Minister of State for Education is saying, look, we're going to open at an opportune time. But then another concern...
Well, let's go to break. Pardon me. I wonder if they're discriminated against the private schools now. They say public schools are the major concerns. But we'll come back to this, gentlemen, in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, Professor Ogunyemi, you've highlighted some of those concerns that you have, as well as several other people may share that concern as well. But how do you suggest we move forward concerning all of this?
Well, thank you very much. Just like the prof in the studio said, the challenge we have here is coming up with realistic plans. The government must go back to the drawing table. Look at the example of Egypt. In reopening schools, schools were grouped into clusters, and for every cluster, ambulance services were provided. Teachers were trained on how to handle emergencies. And the kitting of the students were handled. The decontamination of the environment was handled by government. So what we are saying, in essence here, is it is a public health challenge. And there is a link between the health challenge and the educational challenge. What COVID-19 has shown all of us is that for too long, we neglected both sectors, education and health, and that neglect is coming back to haunt us. So during the COVID-19 lockdown, what a wise government should have done should have been to pay attention to what they needed to do in the education sector. And when we say education sector now, it's not limited to primary and secondary schools. Tertiary institutions as well. Now nobody is talking about tertiary institutions. But one way or the other, we will come back to talk about it. Our classes at all levels, public schools, public educational institutions, they are congested. How do we ensure social distancing? Some models have been adopted in different places. There are alternative day attendance such that a cohort will go now and the other cohort will go next time, either on daily basis or weekly basis or even on timely basis, maybe morning, afternoon shifts and so on. So we are saying that they need to go back to the drawing board. And if stakeholders are talking about what we need to do in both sectors, we should not ignore. Over the years, the neglect in the education sector, the neglect in the health sector, they are the issues we are trying to grapple with here. And if government wants to go ahead, they need to go back and bring all the structures in the educational system and engage them appropriately. I've just told you earlier that the ministry, state ministries have responsibilities, state education boards have responsibilities, local government education boards have responsibilities. The thing has to trickle down such that the implementation will not witness too much of logistical problems. As
Jumping, Prof.
As we have had.
Will that mean then that...
So we should,
I hope you can
learn
hear me,
from
Prof.
the experience of the...
Will that mean that they will have to hold on with implementing this policy while that consultation is going on, or as it goes on, you go on with the consultation? What's your exact suggestion?
Don't go together. You don't put something on nothing. And that is what we have been saying. You don't put something on nothing. The basis for reopening schools is not there yet. Government must go back. That's when I say going back to the drawing board. They have to put what they need to put in place before they open our schools.
I thought you said there was nothing wrong with the timing.
The collective jeopardy.
I thought you said the timing, there was no issue with the timing.
What I was bringing out was that if they thought they have done what they needed to do, no, I didn't say there is no issue with the timing. I'm saying that if they think they have done what they should do, I was just being sarcastic. If they think they have done what they need to do, then they can go ahead. But certainly we know that they have not done what they needed to have done. So because they have not done that, the way forward is that they have to go back to the drawing board, hold on until they put the structures in place, until they put the mechanism for implementing their own policies in place.
All right. Thank you, Professor Abbas. I think there is a contention here. There are a number of issues now, and I don't know if you can take them all in one fell swoop. On the one hand, is a public health issue. Then there is an economic crisis because the schools don't make money. Some of them may not be able to pay their teachers. Some of them are paying their teachers. Then the third issue here is the school calendar. How significantly can we do something about that?
You can respond to him first before you now talk about this.
Yes,
if you want to.
let me respond to the gentleman, Professor Ogunyemi. I sympathize with his views, but we just I have a different approach in terms of how we go forward. Everything he said was fantastic, but at this stage, we cannot hold the country down. We can't hold our schools down and say it is only when the government has gone back to the drawing board and undertaking all these measures that we can reopen the school. These are measures that may not be fixed for the next 10 years or 20 years. You know, they have to be fixed. No question about it. But it's not something we can do now. So then the question is, what next? So we need to devise a way of moving forward. And as I said earlier on, that way is to put realistic measures. For me, what is critical at this point in time is if the government has said, these are the conditions upon which we are going to allow school to reopen, then the government must be able to enforce those conditions. And that was also making examples before when we were unlocked in January. The government can simply not pass that buck to school proprietors who don't have the capacity. Let's put it in context.
Any role the states can play?
Beg your pardon?
Any role the states can play?
Definitely. Definitely. Don't forget that some of these schools, primary, secondary, many of them are within state purview. You know, the state should be able to make intervention on these. Take Oyo State, for instance. Not that I entirely accept what Mr. Makinde is saying, that they want to reopen everything on the 6th of July. But the truth is they were talking about, well, the Oyo State came out and said, if there are issues, we will intervene. We wait to see what that intervention is going to be. But at least there's something now there. Now, going back to what you said, it's a public health disaster. There is a cynicism out there in town. People are talking now and say, oh, the reason that this is biting the government is that the rich ones have not been able to fly out of the country to go and look for health for themselves. That otherwise, we will have avoided some kind of tragedies in the country. Well, that might be cynical, but the truth is it hits at the core of the health crisis that we are in the country. It's a wake-up call in Nigeria today that we need to fix our health system. The same thing is an economic crisis. Teachers are home. They have nowhere to go. Many of them don't have supplementary, which is what forced some schools in Lagos State, I'm sure you're aware of it, about a couple of weeks ago, that have actually been running secretly before the government eventually nabbed them. So we need to move forward. But my biggest thing is the rationale. What is the rationale saying you want to rush reopening of schools now?
Maybe because of the school calendar or something else?
That's what I'm coming to. It is school calendar that, look, we have to look at exit classes. SS3, GSS3, and this and that. But the question is, okay, SS3 year, you graduate, you do your WIPE, whatever you call it, but the universities are not open, so where do you go? So you're stuck. You finish in primary 6, but you cannot move to the next class. So there is a spillover effect from one cadre to another. That is where the challenge is. But the government simply passing the box to proprietors, I don't think is going to cut it at all.
So if your children were in Nigeria, would you let them go back to school?
Well, luckily, they're in Nigeria. Some of them are in Nigeria, So luckily, I say luckily in quote, they're not within that exit group yet, But I said luckily in quote because it doesn't have to be my kids. It could be anybody's kids. And the truth is, I will not be comfortable for my kids to go back to school under these circumstances because I know very well, and I think that's where I agree with what the professor was saying earlier on, that the government will say it. That is a problem with our policies. We come with these fantastic policies, but where is implementation? I was somewhere yesterday, a state apparatus, and out of almost 100 people, only 2 wore masks. And the 2 that wore masks, they put their mask below their nose. They don't even understand. Do you imagine somebody putting their mask like this? When they want to talk to you, they put it down. Then you ask the question, why in the first place? That talks about the question of sensitization. People do not know. They don't understand why they must wear masks. So it's like, I'm wearing mask because the government says I must wear mask. If you know, if there is a proper orientation and mobilization and sensitization of the citizens.
So who is to do that? Federal government or states?
Both
what
of
are
them.
the states doing?
Both of them. But look, this is where the distinction between federal government and state government disappears completely. We're talking about human lives here. It's at a point in time, again, permit me to be using the example of mine, because I work in a government, so I understand a bit of, it's just like in those days when we were debating, when Ambode government was going to do the airport road, this airport Oshodi road, there was a bit of pushback from the federal government. It's a federal road. And we said, look, I was in the executive council. We said, in the executive council, we said, look, those who live on that address are not federal Nigerians or state Nigerians. They are simply Nigerians. So we will fix the road so that when people come out of our airport, the first thing they are looking at will not be the vulcanizers on the high road, relics, debris here and there. Do a fantastic road. You can then go back as federal and state government and sit down and say, you know what, I have taken your stuff. I have spent X amount of money. Can you reimburse me? So that distinction shouldn't matter at all. It is the lives of our children that are in question here. It is the lives of our nation that are in question here.
Well, Professor Ogunyemi, I mean, from your submissions, it also does appear that you are not comfortable with allowing your children go back to school if they happen to be in Nigeria and in this category.
Yes, certainly I would not allow. Even though my children have also crossed that bracket, but I feel strongly for the children of the poor. Because what we are trying to do now is a crash model. It's like an experimental approach. We want to experiment with the lives of poor Nigerians, children of the poor. Many of us in my bracket, many of us in my class, maybe middle class, our children don't fall into that category. And that is probably why we cannot appreciate why we need to do the basic minimum. Are we saying that we should open schools without decontaminating the schools? For a government that could go openly to decontaminate streets, to decontaminate markets, our lives in the schools not as valuable as those working on the streets. We need to do the basic minimum. It's not about income for teachers, income for workers here. It's about what we need to do to ensure that we avert disaster. We feel very passionate about this because herd immunity, which is behind that philosophy of let's open the doors, and when we need to intervene. Why should we be talking about when we need to intervene? I know, from the little I know about what those in medical fields do, in their research, they go as far as 99.9999% validity for their experiment. So it's not something we should gamble with. We have seen various models in other parts of the world, and we have seen where this kind of experimental approach failed. Why should we go that way? We should.
Okay, Professor, just hang on a minute. Let's make this all-inclusive, gentlemen. Let's bring in Dr. Sani Aliyu, the National Coordinator of the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19. They may have put up a message, but how people are internalizing these messages is another thing. I mean, scientists, social scientists, researchers will always have their theory on that. Dr. Aliyu, thank you for joining us today on the program. You may have heard the submissions of the, incidentally, both professors on this program this morning. So what's your thinking about how this policy, modified one, extending this lockdown, particularly as it has to do with reopening schools, is being internalized?
As I've always said, a lot of the decisions we take at the PTF are carefully considered, they're scrutinized, they're heavily debated by all members. We asked the Federal Ministry of Education about a month ago to come up with a plan looking at how schools can be opened safely. What we do know is that schools are incubators when it comes to pandemics, and it's usually the last thing that usually most countries do in terms of opening. But we have a situation here, as the last speaker said, and not the one that's been talking about his opposition to opening, but I believe the other person who was talking about the spillover effect. Here we have a large number of students that are in their exit years. They need to move on. We have exams that are not specific only to Nigeria, but throughout West Africa, the WAEC exams, for instance. We need to find a way to safely get these students to do their exams and exit. Otherwise, we'll have a serious spillover effect when it comes to education. COVID will go away eventually. Yes, it will go away. It may take a year, it may take longer. But what we don't want is to have such a significant impact on our educational programs where children are unable to move at all, where there's no mobility. So we looked at how can we minimize this? How can we mitigate the risk? Because in infection control, what you do is you mitigate risk. If the number of students is reduced drastically, and here we're talking about only one class, SS3 and JS3, if you reduce the number of students in a school significantly and you distribute them among the classes and you make sure that they wear face masks, you make sure that there is hand disinfection, you make sure that there is surface cleaning and disinfection, the risk of catching COVID is significantly reduced. And what's happening is that there are revision classes. As some of us know, even though it was a long time ago we did these exams, there are revision classes that prepare students. Students have been out of school for quite a while, for weeks and months. So we don't even know whether they are prepared or not. And that's why the Ministry of Education is offering these revision classes to be conducted by the schools. But these revision classes, if parents wish, they may not necessarily send their children to revision classes, but certainly when it comes to the exams will hold. And it's important that the students are prepared for their exams. Yes, we have looked at the various modeling scenarios. Opening schools completely is out of the question for now at the stage of the pandemic we are in. But we are reassuring parents that we have really thought about this decision and provided state authorities, because one of the conditions we put within the implementation guideline, which will be published online and over the next few days in the newspapers, is that state governments need to, the state commissioners, the state ministries of education need to make sure that schools are prepared in order to open. Schools should not open if they are not prepared. And this concept of cleaning, which is a good one, remember, these are viruses. You do not fumigate viruses. You don't need to fumigate the schools in order to open them. What you need are clean surfaces that are wiped constantly with dilute bleach. That's what you need. You do not need all this large volume people going around and fumigating, and it's a good thing environmentally, but that's not what deals with viruses. So with the other speaker, I would argue that his argument about disinfection, etc., while it is good, disinfection of surfaces, but not necessarily getting rid of dustbins, etc., which is a good thing environmentally, but it's not related to COVID.
I don't know if this committee, just one moment, I don't know if the committee in that deliberation also considered the fact that because it's a global pandemic, it was possible to renegotiate the school calendar globally. So that, because just as one of our guests here said, when they exit from the exit class, they still remain on the same spot. They don't do anything. So is it impossible to renegotiate globally Because what is affecting us educationally here is affecting them in the UK, in the US, in other parts of the world, even of course in West Africa. Is it impossible to renegotiate the school calendar so that everyone can be on the same page? Because as you know, it's a serious public health crisis.
It is a serious public health crisis, and I absolutely agree. But remember, different nations are at different stages of the epidemic. And it is not true that everybody will stay where he is. Pupils in primary 5 can move on to primary 6. Pupils in different years can still move on. The ones that will have a problem are those going into university, because there has to be some form of arrangement. But even in the UK, for instance, schools have opened in the UK to a certain extent, certainly the ones that my children attend. And just to say, my children are not all in the UK. I do have a child here in Nigeria as well. So we are very much aware. We have been looking at the educational aspect of the entire response itself. We have put a lot of thought into this. And just to say, this is not an experiment. It is not an experiment. We cannot experiment with our children's education. We have looked at how to mitigate the risk, and we are confident that provided the state governments, the state authorities are able to do what they are supposed to do, which is to inspect, to look at these schools and make sure that the arrangements are tight.
Right. You know, when you
that we need in the general population is applied, then the risk really is very low.
You know, while listening to you, you did talk about not knowing whether or not the students are all prepared before they eventually go for this. But yes, we know that, look, life has got to go on. Students have got to go to school. They have to do what they have to do when we all can, because everyone is equally concerned, I reckon. But what about saying, look, because we did ask them, they say they will not allow their children go back to school for those who are in the country are in that bracket, and several other parents feel the same way. And some of them suggest that, look, what about them having their tutorial, whatever it is, at home? When it's time for exams, they just go in, take the exams, and then they pick them from school to the car, go back home, rather than just allowing them just reopen, because some boarding schools may eventually go back to school. Was there any consideration having meetings with ASU and several other unions, just as you did with Labour, before this decision was arrived at?
So the Honourable Minister of State Education discussed widely with the different educational unions. And if you remember, he also had a session with the National Assembly as well. Look, this argument, there are two people there are two sides to the argument, and there are people on both sides of the argument. And I certainly, yes, I empathize with those parents where their kids are in this bracket, where they have been asked to resume school. But yes, we have considered this at the PTF, and we will continue to take it forward, i.e., if you are anxious and you do not want your child to undergo the revision classes, etc., the child should be allowed to stay home, but when the time comes for exams, the exams will hold. They will hold. And remember that some students are actually in boarding facilities, so it would be a lot more difficult to say that those that are in boarding facilities, for instance, will have to travel huge distances. If, for instance, your child is in Ilorin and meanwhile you live in Ibadan, you'll not be able to take your child every day for an exam. So we do understand some of the anxieties related to this epidemic. The anxieties also apply to the general population level. But remember, the measures that we are putting in the school are the very same measures that within the general population people are not complying with. Just like the other speaker said, the issue of face masks, for instance, the issue of physical distancing, the issue of avoiding mass gatherings. These are the same interventions because we are dealing with the same virus. And whatever we implement at the population level is what we will implement at the school level as well. But we have not opened the schools completely. This is a decision that we had to take in order to save our children's future. We do not want the COVID pandemic to have such a huge repercussion effect on the schools, on the school year. Yes, we have looked at this, we have carefully considered it, and the Honourable Minister of State Education has worked very closely with the key stakeholders. But there will always be people at different sides arguing both points.
Well, let me bring you back here in Lagos. Well, you heard perhaps the thinking behind some of this policy. You think some of these things can work out?
To be honest, it's very challenging. I understand some of the points Dr. Ali you made, but the reality is I don't see them really working. The vital question that the gentleman probably hasn't addressed is mine too, at least in his response, was how does the government intend to provide that safe reopening? They call it safe reopening. Are we going to stop children from playing? They will play. That is guaranteed. Most of these schools don't have resources that are at the base of the conditionalities the government itself has given. The government hasn't given a guarantee that it will provide all those resources for the schools. It simply said proprietors must take responsibility for this. And we know that most of these proprietors don't have the capacity. And when I was speaking earlier on, you talk about proprietors when you're talking about proprietors when you're talking about largely private schools. Most public schools you are talking about, they are government-run schools. And many of them don't have the facilities, to be able to underwrite, beg your pardon, all those conditionalities. So I understand the need to say we have to keep our students moving on. But the gentleman did not answer the question that what are you moving them on to? If you live in class 5 SS3, and you want to go and the universities are not open, so where are you going? Let me use the example of Youth Corp as an example. We can all go to university at the same time. We may all graduate at the same time, but we may serve at different times. We may go for our Youth Corp, depending on whether sometimes your schools do not release your transcript in time. I'm a lawyer. I studied law in Nigeria. We will go to law school after...
But that was already an established system.
I understand that. But what I'm saying is that even within the law school, you have different categories. Some people will join us from overseas or from abroad to come and join. They won't go and serve with us. What I'm saying is that what this COVID pandemic has taught us is that we have to start thinking out of the box in a lot of ways in the ways we do things. It doesn't mean that because all our children are in school at the same time, when we have this kind of scenario, they must therefore be programmed to graduate at the same time. Maybe we have to begin to think creatively to say, look, yes, in Ghana, the conditions might be different for them to go, to start. I know it's WAEC, but WAEC doesn't mean that all the conditions that exist in all the WAEC countries, so to say, are similar.
All right. So the key thing there, the thinking has got to be different. That's this COVID period. So Demola Abbas is a professor of international law and global affairs expert. Thank you very much indeed for your thoughts this morning.
My pleasure.
Well, we will be back in a moment. We'll still have Professor Ogunyemi in the studios, and Dr. Aliyu will equally be on hand when we come back in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. Let's get back to Professor Ogunyemi, president of ASUU, to get his views, having listened to Dr. Aliyu's perspective about the thinking behind that reopening. Professor Ogunyemi, I mean, you did hear what he says. Are you in any way empathizing with their situation concerning the thinking behind the reopening?
Well, I sympathize with Dr. Aliyu in some of his comments. But with due respect, I insist that we are still experimenting. When I say we are experimenting, I could see some of his submissions hanging. For instance, when you say state governments are to ensure that 1, 2, 3 things are done, how do we ensure that they ensure? I think in order to concretize some of these things, government, for instance, can come out to say, well, we have COVID-19 emergency fund, and government is going to assist state governments with X number of face masks, X number of body temperature measuring gadgets, and so on and so forth. And he was also saying that disinfecting schools is not compulsory, but it is one of the conditions they made public. I'm not manufacturing this. So if they said that earlier, why is anybody telling me now that we don't need to disinfect our schools before we bring back our children? I mentioned the example of Ghana earlier. The Ghanaian president came out to say the government will do 1, 2, 3 things in schools before our schools are reopened. So when I say experiment, I mean a situation where we are thinking of two approaches to achieving the same goal, believing that either we achieve the same goal or there will be variation in the results, because that's what we are doing. Some students can stay back if they don't want to go back for revision, but those who want to go can go. Is that the way we operate our school system? And is that what we mean by our new normal? We need to put things in clearer perspectives. When we talk of intervention, we expect stronger approach to this intervention in order to safeguard the public health of all of us. So we are not just saying this. We have seen this thing happening in other places. I mentioned the example of Israel earlier. They are rushing to close schools when they saw the spike that arose from opening schools after leaving some gaps. Those gaps should be closed here. We should not say because we saw some schools opening. And he mentioned the example of UK. What did the UK government do before they reopened schools? And even in UK, there are still, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, they are still saying they are not ready to open schools, despite that schools in London are opening. So that is to tell you that the thing is not conceived the same way. Probably they believe that they have not done enough to prepare the students, to prepare the teachers, and to prepare the environment. So
Prof,
these are issues we need to take into context.
So,
It's not
Prof,
a
let's
matter
take
of
those
saying
issues
that,
now.
well, we
Prof,
need to balance the demand or the exigency of the situation.
Right. So,
we-
Prof, let's
we
take some of
actually
these
need to
issues
go beyond
into context,
experimentation
as you
or
said.
talking.
So, Dr. Ali, if you caught the question, can you respond?
Yes, so thank you for that. So as I was saying, with all due respect, Professor Winyemi was talking as if we are opening all schools. Remember, we are opening only 2 classes, SS3 and JS3. We are opening them for a short period of time in order to get the revision classes done and for students to do their exams and pass and exit. When I talk about cleaning, what I'm talking about is this definition of having to do fumigation and getting rid of refuse and etc., which are good things. But this is a virus. It's not a rodent. It's not a rat. What you need is clean surfaces and making sure that students are keeping their physical distancing, making sure that they have hand sanitizers, making sure that the classes preferably are held outside the classrooms. The schools have been closed for several months. We have been discussing at the PTF and we've been looking at different options, and this has been led by the Federal Ministry of Education because we are running a multi-sectoral response. They have worked with other parts of other stakeholders within the educational sector. This decision was not taken lightly. I do empathize with parents that are concerned. And as I said, it's all about behavioral change. He talks about, with all due respect, he talks about the need for government to provide PPE, to provide this, to provide that. But remember, education is on the concurrent list. State governments know what to do. They have been told what to do. A lot of these interventions are not interventions that are specific only from the educational side. They are interventions that need to be applied across the population. We are in very unusual times. We are in challenging times. We know that as a country, developmentally, we are already at a disadvantage. To continue to allow our educational system to be impacted heavily. When was the last time students in Nigeria couldn't move on to the next year? The exams were cancelled, etc. I believe it was around the Civil War period. So yes, this might be the equivalent of a Civil War period, but at least we need to be creative and open schools safely, because the issue is safe. And we didn't say all schools should open. We said the state government should take responsibility, the state commissioners of education, the state ministry of education, to make sure that they look at the schools that can open and undergo revision classes. Yes, some of us, our children have the advantage of the internet and being able to have online educational learning, etc. But the very children of the poor that Professor Ogunyemi is concerned about, and I'm concerned about, are the very children that will be further disadvantaged because they are at home, They are not being taught. There are no educational, very little educational activities. And in the north, for instance, the increased risk of early marriage, etc., linked to this. So we've got to look at the option of the JS3 and the SS3 opening for a short period of time in a safe way to undergo revision for a few weeks and then to have the exam done. We're not even talking about opening the schools altogether. And this will allow some of the schools to know how to prepare when eventually they open. Because COVID will go away. When do we start preparing for this? Only after COVID has gone away? End of the year? Next year? Who knows? But we know that COVID will go away. And some of the measures that we are instituting in the schools are the very same measures. They are the very same measures the rest of the general population needs to do. We talk about distribution of masks, etc. We talk about temperature controls, thermometers, etc. For the state governments, yes, they need to make sure that these schools are provided, and if they have limited resources, the government is already in discussion with some of the states. In the background, there have actually been interventions in some states already when it comes to COVID, but we know that the fiscal space is very tight at the federal level as well. Private schools are there commercially to make money, and they need to ensure that their staff and their students are safe. And as far as the federal government is concerned, we will make sure that those guidelines are there. We talk about ensure. Yes, enforce, but this is behavioral change as well. There's a limit to how much you can enforce when it comes to behavioral change. The use of face masks, one of the speakers spoke earlier about the inappropriate use of face masks. You're not going to have a police all the time asking you to pull your face mask up. We are doing already a lot of public awareness campaigns, risk communication, virtually all 774 local governments. And it's not just about radio jingles or TV jingles. It's also about reaching out to the community leaders, the religious leaders, etc. But with this debate, there will always be two sides to the debate. And there will always be people on both sides arguing both points. But the key issue is we open the schools safely, if it is safe to do so. And for schools that are not prepared, then they shouldn't open. And it is the role of the state government to make sure that those schools that are ready, that have put in place those interventions required, are opened up safely. So, for instance, when it comes to the exams, we're already looking at the prospect of having some of the exams in the outdoor, if the weather permits, so that we further reduce the risk, maintaining physical distancing. And as I said, if you have a school with, let's say, 3,000 pupils and only 1 year is attending, they're not going to be 3,000 students. There will be a fraction of that, and they can be spread across the classrooms. And the teachers that they have as well can be spread across the classrooms. Yes, it will require a little bit of creativity in making sure that this is done, some flexibility, but we need to make sure that our children's education is not further. We are already at a disadvantage. We need to make sure that they are not further disadvantaged globally.
Okay, we'll get that point, Dr. Ali. The creativity component you speak about is, for instance, if there are about 50 or 25 in a class, or 50, and they have to observe social distancing, maybe they have to half it, 25, then they have to move into another class, then they have to get another teacher, and that works in several. So do they have that capacity?
No, I disagree. They don't need to have another teacher because every school has a cohort of teachers. Those teachers can serve the same year. Instead of looking after five years, year 1 to year 6, for instance, you're only opening up a year, you're only opening up SS3 and JS3. There's no reason why, because remember, if they are government staff, if they are government teachers, they are staff as well. They are expected to come to work. A lot of schools, the teachers still to work. It's not that the schools are physically closed. The teachers still come to work and physical distancing, etc.
So I know I know the PTF say time and again that these ideas, there's always that conversation with governors and states to see how they could implement this. In this case, did that conversation hold? Did they give it their backing, saying, yes, we're good, we have this, we can coordinate this properly?
So the Honorable Minister of State Education has been doing a lot of reach out, and we also meet on a weekly basis with a group of state governors under the National Economic Council on a weekly basis to discuss the the COVID response. And in fact, just before we went into this current phase, we had almost a 2-hour meeting with some of the state governors. And it's not just schools we discussed. We discussed interstate borders. We discussed the issue of funding. We discussed the issue of case management, for instance, the issues that relate to isolation. We discussed a host of things. As I said, we didn't sit down at the PTF one day over a cup of tea and just said, let's open schools. No. This debate has been going on for more than a month at the PTF. We've tasked the Honorable Minister of State Education to go back, talk to his colleagues, talk to all the key stakeholders, come up with a policy, and come and convince us. And as I said, he even presented to the National Assembly. This thing is not coming as a surprise. We knew that it was going to come eventually. Schools have been closed for months. The rest of the world and a lot of countries have opened up. And yes, I agree with Professor Ogunyemi. For some countries, they have opened up and they have had to close their schools because of outbreaks. Yes, I agree. But in Nigeria, this situation is different. We are opening up only a few classes and for a very short period of time, as short as possible in order to get this done and out of the way. And schools will open eventually, but we need to make sure that our children are not severely affected by this outbreak.
Okay, so Doctor, could you respond to the part of the data? What data did the PTF rely on to come to this decision?
So as I said, we do look. We have a large team of scientists and data people from across the world, as well as in Nigeria, that provide us with position statements. We specifically task them with questions about the pandemic. What happens, for instance, if we open interstate borders? Can you model and tell us what the issue is? What happens if we want to open international flights? What are the experiences of other countries? How is it likely to impact on the response itself? If you have a situation of sustained community transmission, what impact will it have if you have a small number of classes being open for a short period of time? And remember, with science and data as well, you also look at mitigating circumstances. So with the modeling, we are not saying that students will resume and then they start hugging each other and going about in the usual ways. We say, well, if you're able to achieve a certain degree of compliance in terms of disinfecting hands, in terms of monitoring, in terms of maintaining physical distancing, in terms of reducing the number of people within a particular a building, or even having classes outside, how would this affect the transmission? If we are doing this for a short period of time, what impact will it have on the pandemic itself? So Doctor, there's a lot of thought that goes into this. It's not just about us waking up one day and saying, we've forgotten the children. What about JS3 and SS3?
We're winding down, actually. That's why we need to just get both perspectives. But yes, you say it's a short time, but we know it takes just a day or less for anyone to contract COVID from somebody who already has it. But let's bring in Professor Ogunyemi quickly before we wrap this up. You heard the submissions there. So do you share and agree with some of the points that he's made?
Well, I think I share some of the points that he made when you talk of modeling and data. But the point is, when you have two sides to an argument, the side that should carry the day is the one that has a better informed position. We are saying that, yes, it is an experiment, and I'm sure he has come back to it. When you do something for a short time, you want to see the effect. That is what the essence, that is the essence of an experiment. We pray it doesn't backfire. But in all of this, what we are thinking is, what lessons do we learn? What lessons do we learn? For instance, if the federal government could come up with modifying the school feeding program to the extent that they now want to take the school feeding back to families of the poor, what does it cost us to say, for instance, as part of this experiment, government should ensure that hand sanitizers and face masks to start with,
Professor Ogunyemi,
delivered to those going there.
We need to go, Professor Guyemi. Let me get Dr. Aliyu to quickly respond to that in 20 seconds if he can. Dr. Aliyu, go ahead, please, in 20 seconds if you can. We need to go.
So I very much appreciate both sides of the argument. Yes, you need to weigh both sides of an argument. And of course, there's no easy answer here. Every country is struggling. But the point I want to make is to the general public is we have thought very carefully about this. We have weighed the public health side as well as the side that has to do with the significant impact this will have in terms of the spillover effect into the years. And as I said, we will open the schools as safely as possible. State governments also have a responsibility here. Education is on the concurrent list. It's not just a federal government issue to make sure that those schools that are not ready are not opened, and we continue to enforce those measures that are absolutely necessary to keep us safe.
All right, then Dr. Sani Aliyu, National Coordinator of Presidential Task Force on COVID-19, as well as Professor Abiodun Guyemi, President of the Academic Staff Union of Universities. Gentlemen, thank you both for your time and perspective today on the program. We're back in a moment to take a look at what you think of all of this in just a moment. Join us again.